Well, talking now a little bit about the challenges that we're facing, because, well, it was a new experiment in Latin America. The Brazilian Constitution was the first one in a movement that afterwards was called even the Latin American constitutionalism. So let's think about what that formula brought us in our country. Well, analytical texts versus living constitution. This is certainly a main problem. If you have an analytical text, the original idea will be to constrain, to consolidate some ideas. But as time passes, those ideas might present themselves as not that good. So the idea that analytical texts will be a granting solution that can present security, this is not entirely right. Why did we use that technique? The idea at the moment of the National Constituent Assembly was that an analytical text might favor the enforcement of the transformative intent. The analytical text will establish an agenda to Parliament, and therefore we will deliberate and advance in the transformational intent. But rapidly, the texts will require amendments, because it proved itself not to be that effective. And we have a constitutional process to amend the Constitution that is some sort facilitated. We surely do have a supermajority. You're supposed to have the approval of 3/5 of each legislative chamber, but it's not that difficult to build in Brazil, especially thinking about the hyper-presidentialism and the presidential power in granting financing and budget. So this is what we're facing now, as I have already mentioned, and thinking about the Social Security amendment. So that possibility of amending the Constitution lead us to, we're reaching 100 constitutional amendments in 30 years. So this some sort makes the argument why the analytical text.
Your electoral system, is it majoritarian or proportional system? Is the majority that you have in parliament?
It's majoritarian to the executive, and to the Congress. No, it's representative, and it makes the consideration of the votes that are granted to the party and the votes that are granted to each individual candidate.
But you still manage to have a party with a big majority in parliament.
No. Nowadays we have 30 something political parties, because this is something that it's always mentioned as something that should be reformed, the political system, because it's very generous in granting new parties, the possibility of new parties, and a new party will have public funding for campaigning and things like this. So we have every day a new party coming out.
But you do come together when it comes to a constitutional amendment. They can build the consensus around that.
Yeah, they're going to build consensus considering their own private interests at the time. So when voting a constitutional amendment A, you may have party X and Y building consensus, but in the next constitutional amendment, the same consensus might not reunite the same parties. So, the second result of that tension between analytical text and living constitution is that interpretation became a very important feature in the Brazilian system. So the way that you have to overcome some sort of constraint that an analytical text proposed will be throughout interpretation. And it's a feature that is always referred as necessary to grant the contact between Constitution and the current reality. And now we have a huge debate in academia about the limits on interpretation, because we feel frequently that the Constitutional Court is rewriting the Constitution. And we have now a justice, which I admire very much, very, very much, but he has a new proposition, and he says that the Constitutional Court has a illuminous function. It should push history towards the direction history is supposed to go. I think it's a very bold idea, because I don't know how to push history, and I don't know where history is supposed to go. Maybe this is why I'm not a justice in the Supreme Court. But this is something that is going on in our Supreme Court nowadays. Well, and the combination of those two things brings difficulties in understanding the Constitution as a real system.
Sorry, can I just ask a question? Was that stated in a judgment, or was this a judge giving a seminar and saying that the court...
No, this is something that he frequently refers in seminars, and he has also written. So it's not a moment, a quote of a moment in a social dinner. No, this is his vision of the court. And he says so. I'm not supposing. He says that this is his vision of the court. Yeah, he's one. He's the one who has the courage to say that this is his vision of the court. The other ones, this is a matter for another seminar. So we have difficulties in understanding the Constitution as a system, as an organic body, because it's being altered throughout time, here and there and here and there, and we might face a Frankenstein or something like this. Second challenge that we face is the tension between transformative commitments and legislative inertia. The Constitution bet in the legislative promotion of social inclusion, and that bet proved to be somehow naive. Social transformation requires some sort of prioritization. We're gonna direct our attention to this group instead of that one. And this is usually very difficult to the parliament, at least the Brazilian one. Deciding to prestige this minority or this social group in spite of the other one is usually very difficult. The laws that were supposed to develop the human rights granted in the Constitution, therefore, was supposed to push the transformational project, they didn't came. Because usually legislative will think about the burden of inertia, which is more difficult for me deciding this or leaving things undecided. And usually they will leave things undecided. We have a very particular example, but it's very powerful. The Constitution grants the right to strike to civil servants according to a law that should be enacted. And the law was never enacted. And at a moment in the time, the Constitutional Court says, okay, considering that you do not have the law, thinking of regulating the strike of civil servants, let's apply the law that regulates the strike of ordinary workers. And then representatives were in TV, this is absurd, this is preposterous. How could the Constitutional Court decide something that is in our realm? And they haven't enacted the law up to now. And this decision has something around 10 years. So this demonstrates how the burden of inertia is very relevant and This is why we do not have the legislative development. So Brazil is moving forward in the human rights realm, but usually it will happen more frequently in the liberty rights, in which that burden of inertia is not that relevant. Budgetary considerations is not that relevant, and the exclusion will not be so sensitive. So we're advancing in the human rights realm, in the liberty rights, but in the socioeconomic rights, legislators find out that deciding not to decide is the least risky option. There's a social scientist I think he's from Argentina, Roberto Gargarella, who mentions that this is something very characteristic from Latin American constitutions. We have a mismatch between the organic part, which is very conservative, which is thinking in Montesquieu and those things, and the human rights part, which is very advanced. And we do not have a satisfactory solution to the deliberative inertia. So whenever it happens, it would block the granting of the social right that we might be thinking about. And finally, the new challenge is judicial review and public policies. And this relates with our project in deference. That human rights system provided with immediate application, turned into immediate efficacy, brought, as I have already mentioned, exponential levels in litigation. And the judiciary feels that it cannot become hostage of the other branches. And they react with activist decisions. So if the executive or the parliament, they are not granting the right to housing, so let's decide. Let's grant something. Let's create a provisional decision. And this happens all the time throughout all the judiciary system. Those activist rulings built without a broader theoretical development on the rights content and the state's obligation can result in huge inequality. Because a state judge in Rio de Janeiro might think that the right to health grants surgery X, but the state judge in Rio Grande do Sul might think that it do not grant that same surgery. And it happens a lot. And those institutional features will also influence. For instance, in Rio de Janeiro, we have a very developed public defender's office, very developed, very active. So the level of satisfaction in socioeconomic rights will be higher than in other states in which the public defender's office is not that active. And differential approaches, as I have already mentioned it in other meetings that we've had, are understood as an inadmissible abdication of power. I'm a judge after all. I'm supposed to decide and grant rights. And I'm not supposed to incline myself to whatever reason public administration have presented. Because I'm here, I'm granting the Constitution, and I don't care for the administrative reasons. So differential approaches are rarely applied in our system. It's starting to appear here and then, and the Constitutional Court mainly, but without a theoretical design of whenever you might apply a differential approach. Well, final remarks. The constitutional experiment was able to provide institutional stability despite subsequent political crisis. We have faced 2 presidential impeachments with the 1988 Constitution, and without the menace of military movements, or the political system was felt like stable. So this is something that we should recognize. The Constitution was able to do this. And we have a very relevant social movement in 2013 with students requiring better public services and things like this, a lot of huge manifestations. And at an unfortunate moment, the president at the time, Dilma, mentioned it, so let's reform the Constitution. And everybody said, no, no, we're not supposed to reform the Constitution. It might be, it might have bad characteristics, but it's our Constitution, and we're better with it than without. So it was able to at least lead us throughout these troublesome moments. What about the analytical character? The analytical constitutional tests might sound promising, but it's not enough to bring substantive human rights enforcement, as long as it has no tool to overcome political blockages. So you can write whatever you want thinking about human rights in the Constitution. If you do not have a commitment from the political blockages, and you do not have a mobilization in the social society, in the civil society, the transformative process will be blocked. So it's not enough. Constitution can be seen as a trigger to promote social transformation, but is not capable of doing so by itself. So as a final note, in Brazil, it will be also applicable Abraham Lincoln's phrase, don't interfere with anything in the Constitution. That must be maintained, for it is the only safeguard of our liberties. Thank you very much.